For most of history, Genghis Khan's ancestry has been treated as both obvious and unknowable at the same time. Obvious, because every chronicle begins with the Borjigin line, a chain of fathers and sons recited like a spell. Unknowable, because the man at the center of it left no grave the world can point to with certainty, no body to examine, no relic that can be tested without argument. His empire reshaped Eurasia, yet the question of where his blood truly began has always rested on stories told long after the fact, repeated until they sounded like record. The difficulty is simple. In the 12th century Mongol steppe, history was not written down as it happened. It was carried. In memory, in song, in genealogies spoken aloud beside fires and at councils. Later, those oral histories were gathered into texts, the most famous being The Secret History of the Mongols, compiled after his death for the ruling family. It is a remarkable document, intimate and detailed, and yet it is still a court text. It tells you what the dynasty wanted remembered, and it leaves just enough ambiguity for doubt to survive. Even the Borjigin origin story is built on myth before it becomes genealogy. It begins with a blue-gray wolf and a fallow doe, not because anyone believed a wolf literally fathered a clan, but because legitimacy on the steppe often began with something more than human. Divine favor, fate, a line set apart. By the time Temujin becomes Genghis Khan, that myth has hardened into political language. His right to rule is framed not merely as victory, but as inheritance. And yet, behind the myth, there is a quieter and far more uncomfortable question, not about his descendants, who spread across Eurasia, but about Temujin himself. Was he, in the simplest biological sense, the son of the man history assigns him to? The accepted story begins with a marriage that was not a marriage. Temujin's mother, Hoelun, was already promised and by some accounts already newly wed when she was taken. Yesuge, a minor Borjigin chief, abducted her as she traveled with her husband. In the language of steppe politics, this was not exceptional. It was brutal, but it was common enough to be understood. Hoelun was brought into Yesuge's camp, and she became his wife. Within that story sits an uncertainty that later historians cannot completely erase. How much time passed between the abduction and Temujin's birth? Whether Hoelun was already pregnant when she was taken? Whether the first child she bore in Yesuge's household was unquestionably his? The chronicles insist that Temujin is Yesuge's son because the dynasty requires it. But the conditions of his conception, the violence of his mother's capture, and the speed with which life moved on the steppe leave room for a quieter possibility. That the founder of the Mongol Empire may have begun his life with a paternity question no one could safely ask once power had settled. For centuries, that doubt remained mostly implicit. Mongol and Persian sources had no interest in undermining the Borjigin line after it had become the spine of an empire. Chinese chroniclers recorded what they were told, and what mattered to them was not biological certainty but political reality. Europe, encountering the Mongols later through rumor and catastrophe, invented its own legends instead. By the time modern historians arrived, the genealogies were already ancient, the witnesses long dead, and the steppe itself had kept no paper trail. That is why the question seemed permanently unanswerable. Not because scholars lacked curiosity, but because there was nothing firm to test. No baptismal register, no parish priest, no notary, only a web of oral tradition, later transcription, and the dynastic need for an unbroken paternal chain. In that sense, Genghis Khan's ancestry is the inverse of a modern genealogy. It is grand, public, and widely recited, yet it rests on the kind of evidence that cannot be cross-examined. Still, historians have tried. They have traced the Borjigin names through competing versions of the same lineage. They have compared Mongol accounts with Persian histories like those of Rashid al-Din, written under the Ilkhanate, where Mongol rulers wanted their origins preserved but also polished. They have noted how often foundational genealogies widen, simplify, and sanctify with time. They have pointed out that even the secret history, for all its candor, was composed within the imperial family's orbit, where certain questions would have been unthinkable. And then, in the early 2000s, a new kind of evidence appeared, Not a lost chronicle, not a newly opened archive, but a statistical signal in living bodies. A genetic pattern found not in one family but across a broad swathe of Central Asia, so widespread that it demanded an explanation. Researchers described it as a kind of signature, a Y-chromosome lineage that seemed to have expanded rapidly within the last millennium. A lineage carried by millions of men across regions, once touched by Mongol rule. The implication arrived quickly, almost too quickly. If any man in history could have seeded such a pattern, it would be the one who conquered half the known world. But the answer was not as simple as the headline wanted it to be. The study that ignited this debate did not name Genghis Khan directly. It did not need to. In 2003, a team of geneticists analyzing Y-chromosome variation across Central Asia identified a single lineage, later labeled CM217, that appeared with remarkable frequency in a vast geographic arc, from Mongolia through northern China, across Kazakhstan, and into parts of Eastern Europe. Roughly 8% of men in the sampled population shared this same paternal marker. Statistical modeling suggested it had originated around 1,000 years ago and expanded at an extraordinary rate. The researchers were careful in their language. They described the lineage as likely belonging to a historically prominent male, someone whose social position allowed for unusually high reproductive success. They noted that the timing and geography aligned closely with the Mongol expansions of the 13th century. Only later did journalists supply the name everyone was already thinking: Genghis Khan, the most prolific conqueror in recorded history, whose sons and grandsons ruled from Korea to the Black Sea. The idea was irresistible. Here, at last, seemed to be DNA doing what chronicles could not. A genetic echo of empire, a biological trace of conquest. Popular accounts quickly hardened the claim. 1 in every 200 men alive today, it was said, descends from Genghis Khan. The figure traveled far, repeated in textbooks, documentaries, and casual conversation. It felt definitive, it felt final. But as with the Hitler studies decades later, the closer one looked, the more the certainty dissolved. The first problem was attribution. The CM217 lineage could not be tied to a single individual without a reference sample. No confirmed remains of Genghis Khan have ever been recovered. His burial site was deliberately concealed, protected by taboo and silence. Without his DNA, researchers were making an inference, not an identification. They were observing a rapid expansion of a male line and correlating it with a historical event that fit the pattern. It was plausible, it was elegant, but it was not proof. The second problem was social structure. The Mongol Empire did not expand through one man alone. Genghis Khan's rise elevated an entire elite class. His brothers, cousins, generals, and later his sons' companions all benefited from conquest. Polygyny among the ruling class was common, and the spoils of victory included women taken from defeated populations. A genetic lineage that spread quickly could just as easily belong to one of several powerful Borgigan men, or even to a non-Borgigan leader whose descendants rode the same wave of empire. Some historians also pointed out a quieter irony. If the lineage truly did originate with Genghis Khan, it told us almost nothing about his own father. Y-chromosome studies trace only the direct paternal line. They cannot resolve questions of maternity, adoption, or non-paternity events at the point of origin. In other words, even if millions of men today carry the same Y-chromosome as Genghis Khan, that does not guarantee that Genghis Khan himself inherited it from the man history names as his father. The original uncertainty remains untouched. As the years passed, further studies refined the picture but did not close it. Geneticists subdivided the CM217 lineage into smaller branches, some more tightly clustered in Mongolia, others spreading westward. A few teams suggested that one sub-branch might correspond more closely to the Borjigin clan. Others warned that sampling bias and modern population movement made such claims fragile. The data grew more detailed. The conclusions grew more cautious. Among historians, the reaction was mixed. Some welcomed the genetic work as a valuable complement to traditional sources, a way of testing broad hypotheses about population movement and elite reproduction. Others were more skeptical. They noted that the Mongol Empire left abundant documentary evidence about power, succession, and kinship, none of which required DNA to understand. The danger, they argued, was not that genetics would overturn history, but that it would oversimplify it, reducing complex social processes to a single male line. There was also an ethical unease, familiar from other high-profile DNA studies. To speak of a Genghis Khan lineage risked reviving a kind of biological determinism that history has long tried to escape. It suggested that conquest could be read in the genome. That domination left a measurable mark in blood. Some scholars worried this framed human suffering as a statistic, conquest as a reproductive success story, stripped of its violence. And yet, the fascination endured, partly because the story sits at the intersection of myth and measurement. Genghis Khan was already half legend, a figure whose life blurred into epic even before his death. DNA seemed to promise a way of pinning that legend down, of translating it into something countable and modern. But what it actually delivered was a mirror of our expectations. Where we wanted certainty, it offered probability. Where we wanted a single ancestor, it showed a network. In the end, what the genetic evidence most clearly confirms is not the identity of Genghis Khan's father, but the scale of the world his descendants inhabited. It shows how power, once concentrated, can ripple through generations in ways no chronicler could fully record. It also shows the limits of science when confronted with a past that refused to leave remains behind. The question that opened this story remains, in a sense, unanswered. Not because the evidence failed, but because it answered a different question than the one we asked. DNA can trace expansion, not intention. It can map descent, not legitimacy. It can suggest who might be related, but not why a lineage mattered. The irony is difficult to miss. A man whose life is among the most documented in myth remains elusive in biology. His name endures. His empire is studied. His descendants, real or assumed, number in the millions. And yet the precise thread that connects him to the generations before him still runs through stories, not sequences. What remains after the models and the debates is something quieter. The genetic signature attributed to Genghis Khan does not confirm a single man so much as it reveals a historical condition, an era in which power translated directly into lineage, an age when conquest reshaped families as surely as it redrew borders. The DNA does not tell us who Genghis Khan truly descended from. It tells us what happened once his name began to matter. In that sense, the science does not dispel the myth so much as expose its structure. The Borgigian claim to divine ancestry was never about biology. It was about authority. It was a language of legitimacy in a world without archives, where memory traveled by word of mouth and genealogy was a political act. DNA cannot confirm that language, but it can show how effective it was. If there is an answer hidden in the genome, it is not a name or a face. It is a pattern. One that reminds us how fragile our ideas of origin really are. Genghis Khan's ancestry remains suspended between history and hypothesis, between what can be measured and what must be inferred. The bloodlines that followed him are visible. The one that led to him is not. And perhaps that is fitting. A figure who transformed the world without leaving a grave also left no genetic signature that can speak for him alone. His legacy survives not in certainty, but in scale, not in proof, but in probability. The question was never fully answered. It was only reframed.